Hello, everybody. I'd like to start by thanking Andreas Bär ganz herzlich for the invitation to speak with you. I'm really glad to be able to join you now, especially in these COVID times, even if it's only by YouTube and Zoom and whatever else. Digital is okay. Now, I have a riddle for everybody. What do apocalyptic prophets, Martin Luther, Adolf Hitler, and Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols punk rock band have in common? And the answer to the riddle is that I mentioned them in my presentation. Listen up to find out how. That's the teaser to start. I'm going to start my presentation with a bit of a prelude. There are a few details that I think are worth clarifying at the beginning. The first one is just a terminological clarification, just to make sure we're all on the same page. We understand terms in the same way. It is helpful to understand that I'm going to be speaking about polemics, polemical literature, and polemicists. Kurz auf Deutsch jetzt. Polemik ist eine Gattung von Literatur gegen Feinde und andere angeblich falsch denkende Menschen, und Polemiker sind Menschen, die diese Literatur schreiben und verbreiten. Okay, that's that. Point number 2 in this prelude, it's also helpful to know that what I'm particularly interested in my ongoing research beyond this talk is how medieval and early modern polemics get translated into modern scholarship. In other words, I'm interested in how old accusations and hate literature become respectable among scholars today. An example of this translation of hate into scholarship is another term that I'm going to use a lot in this presentation: Anabaptist, and sometimes Anabaptism. The common German terms are Täufer and Täufertum, but also sometimes Wiedertäufer. A basic definition is that Anabaptists were Protestants who have their roots in the early Reformation, but they were unlike most Protestants because they refused to accept the baptism of children, and instead they only accepted the baptism of adults who could voluntarily choose to join the community of faith. This seems like a reasonable idea, I think, to most people today, but in the early modern world, you have to realize it was a dangerous idea. In fact, Anabaptism, translated as Wiedertäuferei, was a serious crime in the Holy Roman Empire and in other European jurisdictions. People who were convicted of this crime were supposed to be executed. If you wonder why, all you have to do is recognize that in the world before individual rights and democratic thinking, it was very common to believe that people owed obedience to God and God's rulers on earth, absolute obedience. This obedience was customarily organized in the first instance by local parish churches that coordinated power with secular territorial governments. The first contact that a young person had with this apparatus of power was at the time of baptism as a child in a parish church. From the point of view of the established authorities, both church authorities and territorial secular authorities, those Christian reformers, let's call them Anabaptists, who refused to baptize their children seemed to be rejecting the entire structure of good, godly order because they refused to participate in parish churches. Now, I'm using the term Anabaptist in this presentation. It's going to come up a little bit, but I'm mostly in favor of historicizing the term and otherwise rejecting it as a useful term altogether. The reason is that it is a term borrowed from the Imperial Criminal Code, and I think it really distorts our historical thinking. But rejecting the term is a big project, so I will continue to use it for now. For now, just remember this: Anabaptists were those Protestants in the 16th century, mostly in Germany, who baptized only adults. A third point for this prelude is that the 24th and the 25th of June this year, 2020, mark the 485th anniversary of the fall of the besieged Westphalian city of Münster in 1535. By the time the city was defeated, the siege of Münster had lasted 16 months, that is, from February 1534 to June 1535. That is an incredibly long time. The Siege is an episode in Anabaptist history, Täufergeschichte auf Deutsch, and the history of Europe's reformations that continues just really to fascinate me, as it has also fascinated many other scholars. You'll see that much of the Prezi is devoted to a further exploration of the history and historiography of Anabaptist-controlled Münster. Finally, for this prelude, I'll note that in English, it's a convention to put titles of books in italics. I follow this convention in my Prezi. With this in mind, you'll see that the title of my presentation includes the titles of 3 books. So, now, I will go on to the main part of the talk. You can see by my title that I'll be speaking about a historiographical subject. 3 books are the focus of my presentation, and you'll notice that a 4th book by Bruno Latour plays a big role in my thinking, even if only in the background. Perhaps we can talk about this in the discussion after my presentation. However, this presentation is first and foremost about the intellectual legacy of one scholar, Norman Rufus Cohn, C-O-H-N. My main purpose for this presentation is to highlight what for me is very clearly a deep and fundamental conflict at the heart of Cohn's 2 most important and influential books, Pursuit of the Millennium and Europe's Inner Demons. I will also consider some of the implications of this conflict in Cohn's work, which I call a divergent legacy. Furthermore, Cohn's influence on the British medievalist R.I. or Bob Moore provides a useful vehicle for discussing Cohn's positive and negative legacies. To help make my points and add what I hope is a fun twist that won't make the presentation too complicated, I'm going to adapt Ernest Hemingway's 6-word story challenge into a 6-word argument challenge. In the Prezi, I've used orange text to make my 6-word arguments easy to see. I'm not always going to read these out loud, but you'll be able to follow along, pay attention for them, I hope. I've also used the recurring 2-sided face of the ancient god Janus from Bruno Latour's book Science in Action to simplify my points about Cohn's conflicting and divergent arguments. Here's an example. Cohn's 2 most famous and important books are, of course, like I've said, The Pursuit of the Millennium and Europe's Inner Demons. Both books cover roughly the same period of time, that is, from the 11th through the 16th centuries in Europe. My argument is that Cohn wrote his first book to show that polemicists who demonized heretics were right. He believed them. But in Europe's Inner Demons, his 3rd book, Cohn showed how polemicists who demonized heretics helped create a deep and long-lasting state-sponsored tradition of persecution, the persecution of minorities. In the one book, Cohn believed polemicists, but in the other book, he exposed them. Wow, this is quite a stark difference. It's useful, of course, to say a little bit about Norman Cohn's life and his scholarship. I've got 5 main points. The first of 5 important pieces of information to know about him is that his first book, The Pursuit of the Millennium, became an incredible success as soon as it was first published in 1957. Here are a few examples. The 2nd edition of 1961 included endorsements from Bertrand Russell and Hugh Trevor Roper, and the 3rd edition of 1970 added endorsements from Isaiah Berlin and Christopher Hill. These men are among the very most influential public intellectuals in post-war 20th century British life. As a testament to the book's powerful influence, the Times Literary Supplement, a really important publication in the English-speaking world, placed Pursuit on its list of top 100 books published between 1945 and 1995. The book has been translated into at least 10 languages, including German. Remarkably, there have been 3 separate German translations, or at least 3 variations of German editions. The book has been popular in German as well. Given this incredible success, it is not at all surprising that when people think about Norman Cohn, they almost always think immediately of the pursuit of the millennium. This popularity has helped spread Cohn's central argument in this book. That central argument is that there are dangers posed by self-deifying millenarian prophets who apparently encouraged the poor and dispossessed masses, especially in the Middle Ages, to create utopias in the here and now through violence against minorities and established elites. The book points to the dangers of apocalyptic prophets. Here's a second important point, and this is really crucial for my presentation. Almost all the evidence that Cohn used to support his central argument was taken from anti-heretical, polemical, orthodox sources that were aimed at exaggerating the dangers of leaders of religious minorities who opposed the established political and ecclesiastical order. So he took his evidence from the writings of the opponents of the people that he was writing about. He even made clear at multiple points that he was aware of the complications and problems of trusting polemical sources. But he trusted these sources because he thought they confirmed his central argument about the dangers that freelance apocalyptic prophets supposedly posed for civilization. A third important point about the pursuit of the millennium is that Cohn insisted on making the claim that dangerous medieval apocalyptic prophets set the social, psychological foundations for 20th century totalitarianism. In other words, these dangerous medieval apocalyptic prophets were not only dangerous in the Middle Ages, they set a pattern, a historical trend that was really deeply destructive in the very cultural foundations of European history. The claim is most clearly stated in the subtitle to the second edition of 1961, but it is a claim in all three editions of the book. The trouble is, Cohn only asserted this point, but he did not provide any serious evidence for the connection between medieval prophets and modern dictators like Stalin and Hitler. Instead, he seems to have simply relied on the work of other scholars, most notably the German-American political theorist Erich Voegelin, who had made a similar claim in the early 1950s in a book that is called The New Science of Politics from 1952. Here's a fourth important point. It seems to me that sometime between 1957 and 1975, something really significant changed in Cohn's attitude toward the history of heresy in the Middle Ages and its significance for modern history. I'll repeat my presentation's main point and then add for emphasis a really significant point about Cohn's divergent use of sources. So first, reiteration of a main point. In the pursuit of the millennium, Cohn contributed to the vilification of medieval heretics. He made heretics into dangerous villains. But in Europe's Inner Demons, he emphasized how governmental and church officials were the villains who exaggerated the dangers of heretics and witches in order to promote campaigns of repression against them. The result of these campaigns are historical documents created by powerful polemicists, the very kinds of documents that Cohn trusted as evidence of the dangers of heretics when he wrote and revised The Pursuit of the Millennium over several years. But they're also the same kinds of documents that Norman Cohn refused to trust in Europe's Inner Demons. In fact, polemical documents are the kinds of documents that Cohn emphasized should not be trusted and should be contextualized and questioned critically before historians even start to use them. Therefore, in a nutshell, as the English saying goes, the tension between the two books is about how to work with polemical sources. Now, an obvious question is why? Why the change? Why did Cohn change his perspective, his argument, his use of sources sometime between 57 and 75? My suspicion, but only a suspicion, is that his experience directing the Columbus Center at the University of Sussex between 1963 and 1980 was a factor, although I just can't be certain about this. The Columbus Center's research program focused on the historical roots of persecution and genocide. During his time as the center's director, Cohn wrote Warrant for Genocide about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, as well as Europe's Inner Demons. Both books focus on official, governmentally sponsored campaigns to demonize minorities. In other words, both books focus on governments as villains in this ethical account of historical persecution. My fifth point is that Cohn insisted that his two most popular books, Pursuit and Inner Demons, were not, repeat, not fundamentally in conflict at all. Here's the key sentence from the preface to Europe's Inner Demons, where Cohn discusses the relationship between the two books. I'll read. Fundamentally, both books are concerned with the same phenomenon, the urge to purify the world through the annihilation of some category of human beings imagined as agents of corruption and incarnations of evil. At some level, it seems like quite a powerful statement, but this statement says really nothing about who did the persecuting and who were the victims of persecution. That question of who did what to whom is really important. What Cohn did not admit in his comparative discussion of Pursuit and Inner Demons is that the two books reversed the roles of persecutors and victims. The who did what to whom. In Pursuit, Cohn trusted the enemies of heretics, who he described as victims of heretical violence. But in Inner Demons, Cohn emphasized that heretics were primarily victims and government officials and churchmen were their persecutors. What a contrast. It's a fundamental difference between the two books in their attitude towards agents of corruption and incarnations of evil. How could Cohn not admit to this big difference? Well, I can't say for sure why Cohn refused to reconsider the arguments and methodology of the Pursuit of the Millennium after he had written Europe's Inner Demons. Or at least, I can't say why he didn't at least admit to the fundamental tension between his earlier and later work. What is clear to me, however, is that late into his life, and it was a long life, Cohn continued to repeat the wildest and most problematic claims of Pursuit, claims that the persecutors of heretics were to be trusted in their claims against heretics. I think it's worth caring about Norman Cohn's legacy for at least three reasons. The first reason concerns the ethics of research, and it's related to a theme I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. That is, the way that early modern polemics get translated into modern scholarship. I'm a specialist in the history of the so-called Anabaptists, Wiedertäufer, and I think these Wiedertäufer are fascinating because of the hatred they attracted. For example, modern Lutheran historians and popular readers in the modern Lutheran world, such as Josef Sattler, have tended to repeat Martin Luther's hate-filled attacks against the Anabaptists. And modern Catholic historians have tended to repeat anti-Protestant claims about Anabaptists and other supposed heretics. This image from the Amsterdam-nified Research Project webpage is from the mid-16th century, and it's an anti-Protestant woodcut. This woodcut is a good example of the polemical Catholic claim that Anabaptists were among Christ's Protestant enemies. How does Norman Cohn fit into this story of anti-Anabaptist hatred? This question is worth asking because Cohn was not a church historian, and in most cases it was church leaders and church historians who cared enough about Anabaptists to hate them in the 20th century. Cohn did come from a mixed Catholic and Jewish family, but I think most people who know about him would agree that it is best to describe him as a secular scholar of religious cultures. He's not the sort of person who should have hated long-dead 16th century Anabaptists. Nonetheless, he accepted partisan 16th century Protestant and Catholic anti-Anabaptist literature as though it were good evidence of the dangers of Anabaptism. The last main chapter of Pursuit, in other words, the crowning chapter that is meant to give the book a strong finish, and one of the most often cited chapters of the book. It's really a very popular chapter in a popular book. This chapter is about the period of Anabaptist rule at Munster between 1534 and 1535, and that chapter relies upon and popularizes the polemical story of Anabaptist madness that the Catholic polemicist Hermann von Kersenbrock composed in the 1560s and 1570s. In effect, what Cohn did in the last chapters of Pursuit was to rejuvenate a centuries-old, hate-filled story. I'll say this strongly and clearly. This is an example of sloppy and bad scholarship. What's more, it is also merely one of many examples from the Pursuit of the Millennium of how Norman Cohn, a supposedly critical secular humanist scholar, well trained in the careful use of sources, accepted and retold obviously biased old church histories. In other words, Cohn gave new secular scholarly respectability to old religious polemics and hate. Many readers since 1957 have thought that they can trust the old warnings against apocalyptic prophets and other so-called fanatics because a careful scholar, Norman Cohn, who cites many primary sources in many languages, has evaluated these warnings and found them to be trustworthy. This is really what lots and lots of very smart and serious people who have been attracted to Cohn's stories in the Pursuit of the Millennium have thought. From this point of view, old prejudices are worth repeating as though they are reliable knowledge because an authoritative researcher has approved them. We should recognize that scholarship really does depend on trust. We can't do all research anew again, so we have to trust research that's been done before. The trouble with the Pursuit of the Millennium is that it confirmed the pre-existing anti-Anabaptist prejudices of many Protestant and Catholic readers in the post-war period of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And as a result, these otherwise smart readers put aside their critical thinking skills because, well, even though we have to trust research that others do, we still can evaluate that research critically. They didn't do that in most cases. Now, I've already written about Cohn's retelling of the myth of Anabaptist madness, and anyone who's interested in Anabaptist history can find out more by exploring the Prezi that I have made for this presentation. One of the windows, this one, is what I call a visual summary of an essay I published just a few years ago in 2018. In the essay, I draw a contrast between what I call thinking inside the cages of polemical sources, which I warn against, and thinking outside the cages of those polemical sources, which I am trying to promote. This is a warning and a recommendation that applies much beyond Norman Cohn's work. I've also added a lot of extra and new images that are not things I discuss in the 2018 essay. I've added them to this Prezi, and if you go to the top right-hand corner of the Prezi, you can see, for example, a series of artistic depictions of famous sieges that Erhard Schön, a 16th century artist, composed. This series included lots of images from the siege of Münster in 1534 and 35, but many more. And that helps you perhaps contextualize Münster and its Anabaptist history in a very different way from the type of way that Norman Cohn did. That's just something fun to explore if anyone is interested. Now, I'll move back to the main Prezi frame while I present a second reason for my interest in the legacy that Cohn has left us. And the second reason is that despite my deep concerns about the ethically questionable impact of the pursuit of the millennium, I acknowledge and am really fascinated by the various ways that writers have been inspired by this very popular book. Among the many examples of this fascination and reception of the book are Marxists of different stripes, such as Christopher Hill and Raoul von Eichem, who accepted much of Cohn's history of apocalyptic prophets. But instead of seeing these prophets as threats to European civilization, they saw them as counter-cultural heroes. In other words, these authors accepted the outline of a subject, but not the negative valuation of that subject. If anyone's interested in learning more about this kind of inversion of research and historical values, I can recommend this book, Greil Marcus's History of the Sex Pistols, the English punk rock pioneer band whose lead singer, Johnny Rotten, was born with the name John Leyden. At this point, it's helpful to know that Jan van Leyden is the name of one of the main leaders of Münster during the siege of the 1530s. Jan van Leyden famously claimed to be a king, and many polemicists have lampooned him as a false and dangerous leader. Norman Cohn is one of those. In the 1930s and 1940s, it was even fashionable to compare Hitler to Jan van Leyden, and Cohn again did this. In Lipstick Traces, Greil Marcus throws that comparison into disarray. For Marcus, the historical equation is not Norman Cohn's older suggestion that Jan van Leyden, the so-called false monster king of the Anabaptists at Münster, prefigured Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, but a rather more harmless and playful connection. Jan van Leyden prefigures Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols. As a side note, you learn from Lipstick Traces that Norman Cohn's son, Nick Cohn, is one of the most important music journalists of the late 20th century, and Nick Cohn's writing about rock music history apparently shows the influence of his father's fascination with medieval prophets. These are just a few examples, and they should be enough, I hope, to explain that my interest in the pursuit of the millennium extends beyond the ethical and scholarly criticism of the book itself, and then goes into a broader exploration of pop culture. A third reason for why I think it's worth paying attention to Norman Cohn's work is that I see in the two divergent threads of Cohn's legacy a very clear embodiment of what the British medievalist Bob Moore has called the war on heresy among the scholars. First, here's some background. You might have heard of the medieval heresy of Catharism, die Katharer, glaube ich auf Deutsch. According to most histories of medieval heresy, Cathars first emerged in the High Middle Ages, around the same time as the Franciscans and the Dominican orders. These Cathars are not really Christians, the story goes. Instead, they were dualists who believed in two gods, a good god and an evil god. In other words, they had a different theology than Christians. In addition to having teachings about God that were fundamentally at odds with Catholic teachings, Cathars also had their own sacraments and their own unique leadership structure. In other words, the Cathars were a coherent, well-organized counter-religion that challenged medieval Catholicism in a powerful way. According to these standard histories of Catharism, it's little wonder then that Catholics organized military campaigns against Cathar strongholds in southern France in the 13th century. These crusades were bloody and involved much cruelty. No right-thinking historian today would approve of such violence, but many historians do try to understand Catholic hatred of Cathars, which seems to make sense from a medieval point of view because of the profound challenge to Catholic ideas and authority that the Cathars posed. The Catholic war on Cathar heretics might not be justified in today's moral terms, but it might be understandable if we think historically. At least, these are the kinds of claims that are often made in textbooks about heresy and about the Cathars in the Middle Ages. It's a very general overview. I hope it's fair. Bob Moore is an expert on medieval heresy and the persecution of heretics, and he used to accept this standard history of Catharism. However, he has been influenced really strongly in recent years, particularly by French and Australian research, that has reevaluated the sources that are supposed to provide evidence for the existence of Cathars as a coherent counter-religion. Moore's new book, The War on Heresy, is partly about the Catholic anti-Cathar crusades in France, but it is also about much more than this. Moore puts the anti-Cathar crusades into the broader history of persecution of heretics. One of the main themes of Moore's research since the book The Formation of a Persecuting Society has been to trace the rise and course of a European culture of official persecution against heretics and other minorities. In other words, Moore has been building upon the scholarly legacy that Norman Cohn helped promote in Europe's Inner Demons in particular. In The War on Heresy, Moore goes further to argue that as part of the campaigns against heretics, Catholic officials and medieval Catholic chroniclers also wrote legal documents and historical accounts that created a trail of sources for the existence of Cathars and for their theology and their unique leadership structure. The problem is this: these sources were almost always justifications after the fact for Catholic violence, and they exaggerated the Cathar threat to Catholicism, as well as the coherence of Catharism as a counter-religion. Moore argues that because the evidence for Catharism depends so fundamentally on polemical sources, the standard history of a coherent dualistic counter-religion in the heart of Christendom has to just be rejected. In other words, Catharism was an invention of Catholic enemies. Moore's thesis is, you probably won't surprise you, it's controversial. Evidence for this controversy is the collection of essays from 2016 entitled Cathars in Question. I'll emphasize that I find Moore's case in The War on Heresy to be very convincing. And if he's right, then the standard history of Catharism is another example of what I call the translation of medieval and early modern polemics into modern scholarship. Moore's last chapter in The War on Heresy is entitled The War Among the Scholars. The chapter considers why it might be that so many generations of serious and excellent scholars have failed to read polemical sources with the critical reflection that should be the hallmarks of all good historical research and historical thinking. Moore's question about the failure of generations of scholars to do source-critical work is an especially fascinating one, I think, when applied to Norman Cohn. To use Moore's metaphor, the metaphor of war, Cohn engaged passionately in the intellectual battles of the Middle Ages because he believed that medieval culture and medieval battles shaped modern culture and modern battles in profound ways. The trouble is, I think, Cohn fought rhetorically on both sides of the war on heresy. In other words, Cohn was at rhetorical war with himself, but this was a struggle he never, ever acknowledged. This fundamental tension at the heart of Cohn's legacy explains why those cultures who build upon Cohn's ideas in the pursuit of the millennium rarely mention Europe's inner demons and also why those who have been inspired by Europe's inner demons rarely mention the pursuit of the millennium, at least not in a positive way. Here's the big question that seems to follow. How was Cohn able to maintain this deep tension at the heart of his work after 1975? How was he able to expose the demonization of medieval heretics that he did in Europe's Inner Demons without admitting that he himself had contributed to the demonization of heretics when he wrote and later continued to promote the pursuit of the millennium? He accomplished this balancing act by carefully dividing the subjects he wrote about in the two books. For example, the Anabaptists who he portrayed so vividly as villains in Pursuit would have been, and I think should have been, a subject of at least some discussion in Europe's Inner Demons. But I can't find one mention of them. Instead, Cohn focused Inner Demons on the demonization of Waldensians and Cathars, subjects about which he had written very little in Pursuit. And he certainly hadn't made Waldensians and Cathars into villains in Pursuit of the Millennium. Here's my conclusion. In his various books, Norman Cohn was certainly not shy at all of taking moral stands. Largely because of Cohn's willingness to write about the dark history of European persecution, William Lamont concluded his eulogy to Cohn with the statement that Cohn spent a lifetime on thinking with demons, and we have been immeasurably the richer for it. My view is more complicated. I think that the pursuit of the millennium has set back scholarship in a way that is very bad. Rather than being a book ahead of its time that charted new research territory, a variation on Lamont's claim in the eulogy, that 1957 study gave medieval and early modern polemics new life and new audiences and new authority. In other words, Cohn wasn't charting new research territory, but rather recycling a framework of interpretation that was at least 800 years old. Cohn knew what he was doing. And because of this, I argue that his legacy from the pursuit of the millennium is a shameful one for reasons that Cohn himself outlines in Europe's Inner Demons. Outlines, but doesn't acknowledge. I think it's really too bad that Norman Cohn never recognized or acknowledged the problems at the heart of his divergent and conflicted intellectual legacy. Just before the discussion starts, here are some bigger thoughts on my part. I think that reflections on Cohn's divergent legacies are important well beyond the study of his work on its own. Histories of all kinds, I think, are torn and divided by deep internal contradictions. Not only the history of medieval history, not only the history of medieval heresy, but also Reformation history and the history of European and global Christian confessionalism are torn by systematic interpretive tensions and problematic inheritances of the sort that are fundamental to Cohn's divergent legacies. In fact, this is the kind of thing I'm working on at the moment. You see the proposed titles for my work in progress. I've got a big question for everybody here. You can think about this and maybe contribute your own ideas. Can you think of a scholar whose legacies are full of deep tensions, like I claim is typical of Cohn's work? I have a few other suggestions. I won't say much about them, but here they are. One is Max Weber, the very famous so-called father of sociology. A second suggestion is Bruno Latour, the French anthropologist and philosopher whose book Science in Action I reference several times in this talk. Latour is a hero of mine in a way, but in the last 20 or so years he's become a fan of Eric Voegelin's political thought. And from my point of view, Voegelin's work is embarrassingly bad scholarship. It's a type of scholarship that inspired Pursuit of the Millennium and it is a wrong turn in 20th and 21st century historical thinking and political thinking. Okay, time for discussion. I look forward to chatting with you. Und zu merken ist, dass ich gern auf Deutsch sprechen möchte, wenn es klappt. Und es ist okay, mich Mike zu nennen. Das finde ich in Ordnung. Mike oder wie Herr Driedke, wie Sie wollen. Danke für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.